beings meet the living God. Because it starts off, Leviticus is after the book of Exodus, which finishes with the tabernacle. You remember the tabernacle is this tent, this movable place of worship, like a movable temple in the desert. And the tabernacle at the end of Exodus is filled with the glory of God. It's an extraordinary thing because they started off in slavery, not knowing where God was. Now God is with them, but Moses could not enter. God is there, but Moses could not enter. Another way of seeing that question is there's actually two words for tabernacle that are used. Two words. One means dwelling, and the other means tent of meeting. And the question is, can it be both? It is dwelling. God dwells there, but can it be a tent of meeting? Can we actually meet this God? So it really comes down to that question as we start with this book. Can we meet God? We're looking at the fourth and fifth offerings here. There's 5 offerings. And both of these are to be a remedy for sin. It tells us that at the start of both chapters, a remedy for unintentional sin. Just to throw the cat amongst the pigeons this morning and ask you a question. It's a true or false question. You don't have to unmute and answer, but I'd love you to think, is this true or false, this statement? The gospel, or good news, is that Jesus died for my sins so I could go to heaven. The gospel is that Jesus died for my sins so I could go to heaven. Is that true or false? It's great when you're all on mute, because I can throw out these controversial things and I get no blowback. Let me give you an Irish answer. It's both. In the sense that the statement that Jesus died for your sins, you can go to heaven, that is true. That's clearly true. But when we say this is the gospel, we reduce the gospel to that sentence only. And all the other facets and dimensions of the gospel are lost. We get a half gospel, a truncated gospel. And part of what Leviticus does is when we explore these offerings and we see what these mean, is we see the multifaceted dimension of the good news of Jesus, who fulfills all of this. So we're going to look primarily at the fourth offering this morning, the purification offering. Now, we mentioned that with all of these things, there's so much detail because they actually did these things. They actually practiced this, where they took an animal and did it. So the detail is written out for the people following it. But we now, thousands of years later, get bogged down in the detail. But what I found helpful as I've been reading it is to see in each offering, what is unique about this one? How is this one different from the others? And that's really helped me to try and get a sense of what the meaning is here. So what's different here in the fourth offering is the sacrifice is brought, a young bull, it's slaughtered, but then the priest, first 5, takes the blood from the bull. And he does 3 things with the blood. And this is the unique part of this offering. First, he sprinkles some of that blood before God. So that's at the curtain to the Holy of Holies. He doesn't go into the very place where God dwells, but at the entrance, the curtain, he sprinkles 7 times the blood. Then in the general tent, in the holy place, he applies blood to the incense altar. And then lastly, thirdly, out in the courtyard outside the tent, he applies blood. He pours out the rest of the blood at the sacrificial altar. Now, we don't hear of that in the other 5 offerings. So that's the unique thing about this one. The blood is being applied to the sanctuary. The focus is not on the sinner. The focus is on the sanctuary, the dwelling place where God dwells. That's where the blood is applied. And if we read on and see the references in the rest of the book to this offering, this draws out this meaning for us. So chapter 15 we'll get to. Not really looking forward to that one. That's one of the tricky ones. It's all the purities and uncleanness. But it says this in 15 verse 31. You must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean. That's the focus of that chapter. So they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling my dwelling place. The uncleanness can defile, can pollute, can make dirty the place where God himself dwells. The next chapter, chapter 16, is the Day of Atonement. James has signed up for that. That's the best passage in the book, and James has nicked that one, James Clancy. And it's the day of the biggest sacrifice once a year. And it says this, 16 verse 19, he shall sprinkle some of the blood on it. He actually, at this stage, just once a year, just the high priest goes inside the curtain. And it's a fourth place where blood is sprinkled onto the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies. He sprinkled some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times to cleanse it. To cleanse it. So sin, uncleanness can defile the tabernacle. It can defile the place where God himself lives. And then atonement is needed to clean it. And that's what's happening in the sacrifice. The 3 parts of sprinkling the blood of the bull, of pouring it out, it is to clean the tabernacle. The focus here is on purifying, on cleaning. And it's the sanctuary where God dwells. Now, I think this sort of opens up for us a different dimension as to what sin is and what salvation is. Because sin here is now a real thing. It's got real physical consequences and impact in the world. It's not just that we're guilty before God and we need a sacrifice. That's true. But it's not just that. It's gone into this community. It has defiled and polluted this community, including the place where God dwells. Sin leaves a residue. Sin leaves a stain. It leaves a mark on the community and indeed on the place where God dwells. Sin impacts. And we saw that this summer when one sin, the awful murder of George Floyd, had an impact across a whole country. From people protesting for justice to sins of racism coming to the surface in response, and other things. Sin affects the community. I want to say, partly in the context we're in, that to me, sin is like a virus. Now, my level of biology knowledge is about year 2, I'd say, in secondary school. But we've all been learning more about virus in the last while. And sin is like a virus. It spreads through a community and impacts in real ways. And to wash your hands is not enough. Yeah, we want to wash our hands at the moment because of the coronavirus. And it means that if we've picked something up, we're not going to put it on our face and inhale it into our system. But that's not enough because sin spreads so easily. We've got to wear a mask so we don't pick it up and we don't spread it. We've got to do 2 meters social distancing and all sorts of things so we don't spread it. And now we've come to a stage where we're not allowed to do home visits because you don't know where the virus is. And so there's this danger, even someone who's your best friend or someone who's in your family and you're a really good person, you trust them and they're sensible, but you just don't actually know. But what if you did know that the virus was in a particular house, the coronavirus? Would you enter that house? If you did know, we're not entering and we're not sure where it is. But if you did know, you wouldn't, surely. And as sin goes through this community, the virus of sin goes through this early Israelite community, God cannot stay in that community where sin is present. He cannot stay there and live there and dwell there. There was this holy place, this tabernacle in the midst of their community so God could be with them, but it is now made into an ordinary place from being a sacred place. And so for God to stay with these people, the sanctuary itself needs to be made clean. So this sacrifice cleans and purifies the sanctuary so God can stay with his people. And this has impacts for the whole world because the tabernacle is a picture of the world. And when the first blood is sprinkled, he sprinkles it 7 times, this number of creation, because it's about remaking the world. When the temple is then cleaned and God can stay, it's like God with his people as it was at creation. That number 7. How it should be. So I want to ask you, if the sacrifice here, this offering, is to clean the tabernacle so God can be with his people, where is God's sanctuary now? Where does God live now? Because that was hundreds of years before Jesus came in the Old Testament. Now Jesus has come and everything has changed, and we interpret these passages through the light of Jesus. Well, God lives in us. God resides in us. We are called the temple of God now. 1 Peter 1 picks up on this very type of offering by saying that we have been sprinkled with his blood. Sprinkled with his blood. So what happens now is not that this principle has moved on in dramatic fashion. It's no longer that a physical place of worship is purified or made clean, but that you and I, the worshiper themselves, are made clean internally so that the living God can dwell in us. In Leviticus, a physical place of worship made clean so God can stay in the community. Now we ourselves are made clean that God can live in us. So you've had this movement from Exodus where is God at the start of the book? They don't know where God is. To then at the end of the book, they have this tabernacle. God lives with his people. And then Jesus comes and you have God physically in person, walking around and talking to people and touching them in the community. And now again, a further development is that the Spirit of Jesus lives in his people. I don't know if we realize how earth-shattering that is. But the living God, the holy God of Leviticus, who needed all these sacrifices, his holiness has not changed. Hebrews calls him a consuming fire. But you and I have changed. We have been made clean. We've been sprinkled with his blood. And the living God lives in us. I'm not going to have time to go into the second one that Tom read, but let me say this. When we see all these different offerings, they all cast a slightly different angle on the sacrifice of Jesus. When we sin, we're unacceptable before God, and it requires death. So that first burnt offering, an animal, is sacrificed instead. That pays a price, so we don't have to. The fourth offering here we've talked about now, sin defiles, it pollutes. And so the sacrifice cleans and purifies. And the last one that Tom read out, the fifth offering, the reparation offering, means that we owe a debt to God when we sin. We're in covenant relationship with God and we owe him a debt, and a sacrifice repays that debt. That's why Tom read in chapter 6, which was, there's a parallel where we sin against a neighbor. There's a parallel to sinning against God. And what you have to do is you have to make amends. And that means returning what you have stolen, repaying the debt. And you and I would have to return what we've stolen from God by being his creatures, yet not obeying him and living with him. But a sacrifice does that. And for us, that is the sacrifice of Jesus. So I might close by reading Isaiah. Adi brought us into the book of Isaiah earlier this morning. And Isaiah 53 makes particular reference to an offering for sin. And that is the fifth offering in chapter 5 and 6, the reparation offering. That Jesus was that offering for us to repay our debt. An offering to take our place, an offering to repay our debt, an offering to clean and purify us. So I'm going to read Isaiah 53 to close from verse 7. This prophecy, this great prophecy of Jesus. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, that is a reparation offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Amen.